Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So this is the first CWEEL webinar of 2023. So welcome and thanks for joining. We're going to get started here. All right, so the Council on Women in Energy and Environmental Leadership, and that's CWEEL, are a division of the Association of Energy Engineers, and we're hosting this webinar today. Our organization aims to advance gender equality in the historically male-dominated fields of energy and the environment. And we do that primarily through career support, professional networking opportunities, and through technical training. And so today's event is actually hosted by the CWEEL Canada East chapter, and that encompasses a large region from Ottawa, Ontario, and east through the Atlantic provinces, including Mohawk, Algonquin, Haudenosaunee, Mi'kmaq, and the Beothuk Indigenous lands, just to name a few. And I encourage you to use the Native Lands tool and let us know where you're joining from in the chat box. I've got that QR code here. And so throughout the session, we'll also encourage you to ask your questions in the Q&A chat box. But before we get started, we also just wanted to do a quick little housekeeping and present an event that we've got coming up next month. So here we have the CWEEL Roundtable, which we're launching in June. This is going to be a monthly event, and you can join once, twice, or every month if you'd like. And it's basically going to involve receiving some multimedia materials, reviewing those before the event, and then coming to the event ready to have a discussion and answer some questions. And I've got another little QR code there. If that's something that you're interested in receiving some emails about, we can definitely loop you in for that event that will be starting next month. So getting into today's event, my name is Jana, and I'm joining from Halifax, Nova Scotia today. That's on the ancestral and unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. And I'm pleased to present our speaker, Cassie Pitchford. Cassie is a mechanical engineering student at the University of New Brunswick and an avid volunteer in the local and national community. She serves as the president of the Diversity Within Engineering chapter at the University of New Brunswick, and she's been awarded the 2022 Canadian Federation of Engineering Students Advocacy Award and the 2022 New Brunswick Youth Human Rights Award. So congrats on those, Cassie. And let's give a big virtual round of applause for Cassie, and I'll let you share your slides and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jana. Alrighty. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah, I can see it, Cassie. You're good.
Awesome. Thank you. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today. I'm grateful to Jana, CWEEL, and the Association of Energy Engineers Canada East for the opportunity to present this session on working to create inclusive spaces for you all today. My name is Cassie Pitchford, and I use she, her pronouns. So while we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Today, I'm calling from the ancestral and traditional territory of the Wolastoqiyik or Maliseet peoples. I share this land with the Kingsclear First Nation, St. Mary's First Nation, and Oromocto First Nation. As an immigrant who has spent the last decade in Canada, I have my own role to play when it comes to deepening my knowledge of Indigenous history and efforts of reconciliation. Land acknowledgements are more than a disconnected statement about who was here first. It's where we're going next. They give space for reflection about where we are with our own journeys, learning about Indigenous history, and our active role to play with reconciliation. As engineers or engineers to be, we have a unique role to play, not just personally, but professionally. We have a unique knowledge to impact our world in incredible ways, and we must ensure ongoing commitment to reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. We're all at different places on our learning journeys. If you don't know already, I encourage you to learn about the ancestral land where you work and live by visiting whos.land or the QR code Jana posted earlier. Also in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada issued 94 calls to action linked on this slide, and you'll receive a PDF of the slides in the chat after the presentation. I encourage you to read through and reflect on how we as a country are working to reconcile and identify opportunities to continue on this path of healing. Now I'd like to share with you who I am and a bit of my journey to speaking with you today. In the image on the right, you see me with my partner Alex and 8-year-old stepdaughter Melody. I'm also a mechanical engineering student at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, where I will graduate next May, and my family plans to stay. I have a unique journey in that I began to lose my hearing 5 months after starting university. I struggled to learn my rights and how to enforce them, and adjusting to life with hearing loss was very difficult on top of full-time school, part-time work, and everything in between. My personal experience made me committed to serving my community through various local, regional, and national student leadership roles in EDIA, or Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Accessibility, Advocacy, and Conference and Competition Organization. I have since finished my second term as president with Diversity Within Engineering, and I've just begun my new role as senior advisor. Previous to my role as president, I spent 2.5 years as the vice president of inclusion. Through various projects and initiatives, I've been honored with various awards Jana mentioned, including the Canadian Federation of Engineering Students Advocacy Award, the UNB Third Century Merit Award, and the 2022 New Brunswick Youth Human Rights Award, which you see in the image on the left. It's been exciting to marry my disability advocacy with my engineering knowledge to make the university's campus more accessible and inclusive for all. And I'm excited to carry that momentum forward as I wrap up my degree and enter the workforce. Before we begin, I did want to note that this presentation does cover sensitive topics, and please disconnect at any point if you need the break. There will be time to answer questions at the end of the presentation. And throughout this presentation, I do encourage you to check in with yourself and challenge your own unconscious biases. I also wanted to note that this presentation is not the be-all end-all for EDIA. This presentation is informed by my own lived experiences and research over the years. It's not all-encompassing, and it's meant to serve as a piece of your own PDF, of your own learning journeys. So our outline for today, we're going to discuss why these discussions are important, especially in the engineering space. We'll discuss unconscious biases, equity versus equality, barriers to EDIA, discuss what diversity and inclusion is, how we foster an inclusive environment, and I do have some tailored EDI resources at the end of this presentation. So over the years, we have seen a movement to improve inclusion for people from historically excluded groups in society, and our profession is no different. People from historically excluded groups include women, LGBTQIA2S+ people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and disabled people. For example, women were banned from attending the University of Toronto until 1884, and barely 100 years ago in 1918, the Queen's University Senate banned Black people's admittance into their medical school due to intolerance from the local white community. We've come a long way in a short time, and there is still work to be done. That's why presentations like these are so important, and I'm honored to be a piece of that. As practicing engineers, members in training, and engineering students, we cannot fully serve the public if we as a profession are not made up of people from different parts of society. Our diverse experiences and perspectives drive innovation, and our voices are necessary at every level of management to drive culture shift and create safer and more inclusive spaces. It's also important to note that qualified professionals are leaving because they don't feel like they belong in our profession. Students are graduating with engineering degrees and choosing alternate career paths because they had to fight so hard to belong in engineering school. There are also people who leave industry after years of service due to undermining, bullying, and other traits of toxic workplaces or cultures. We're all here to learn and grow, and that growth can feel uncomfortable. We strive to be good people and come to the table with good intentions, and it can feel uncomfortable if you realize there have been times where your impact wasn't what you intended it to be. The difference is what you do with that discomfort once you determine where it's coming from. Do you sit with that discomfort and change nothing? Or do you use that discomfort to propel personal growth and be the best you can be? That's for you, and you will need to decide. With our why in mind, I'd like to introduce the concept of unconscious biases. Unconscious biases are stereotypes about groups or people. You're not actively thinking about these things, they're in the back of your mind, and they shape the thoughts at the forefront, such as prejudice. Everyone has unconscious biases, and they're shaped by things like our experiences growing up, our cultures, and who and what we surround ourselves with. We have unconscious biases about a plethora of things, including age, race, religion, and more. The QR code on this slide opens a link to Harvard's implicit bias tests, and they're available on a variety of topics. They can be completed on a phone or a mobile device, and of course, your computer. It's not a perfect indicator of how biased or not you may be when it comes to a particular group of people, but I found it to be a good starting point as I began my own reflections with my thoughts and why I think the way I do. For example, I used to be almost 300 pounds. I was bullied and looked down on because of my weight, and I was uncomfortable with who I was in the mirror. Years later, after losing 80 pounds, I took the weight implicit bias test, and I was actually really surprised to find that my results showed a slight bias towards overweight people. I was the third bullet point on this slide. I was like, I can't be biased towards overweight people. I used to be in that place. And this isn't to say that I looked at someone who's bigger than me and thought they were gross or that I was better than them. As I took the time to reflect with myself, I came to learn that my implicit bias may have been rooted in my own disdain for my physical appearance at that point in my life, because I could only think negative things when I looked at myself. So it makes sense if those thoughts bled into how I saw others whom I thought looked similar to me. As we reflect and notice our own unconscious biases and where they come from, as I mentioned earlier, it's normal to experience discomfort. And I relate this to having sore muscles in the gym after having a hard workout. This feeling is an opportunity for growth. Unconscious bias doesn't mean you're a bad person or you're hateful towards a group of people. I simply use these tests, and I encourage people to look at them as opportunities to check in with yourself and think about why you may think a certain way. And the following points on this slide are some tips for countering unconscious bias. So I encourage you to spend time with people who aren't like you. This can take form in many ways. It could be having casual conversations with coworkers you don't know very well. It could be following content creators on social media that have a different culture or religion than you. Or you could also take time to visit an Indigenous education center if you have one nearby. It's also important to own up to your own mistakes when they happen. We're all human. Quickly apologize, correct yourself, and carry on. If you make a big deal out of your mistake, sometimes that can make things worse for the person who's impacted by your actions, because then they feel obligated to console you, say, oh, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. But if you're actively encouraging others to be more inclusive, you have to be a part of this movement yourself. And being here is a good step in that. So thank you again for being here today. Next, we have equity versus equality. So the words sound very same, but they do not mean the same thing. So equality centers around giving everybody the same tools. It's the idea like no special treatment. So in the image on the left, you see everybody is given a box to stand on, so they're able to see the game. The person in the red shirt has no problem seeing the game. The person in the middle in pink has trouble seeing, and you can see they're on their tiptoes. And then the wheelchair user in the blue shirt isn't able to get on top of the box. Contrary to equity, which centers around ensuring everyone has the tools they personally need to level the playing field. This takes the cookie cutter approach or one size fits all approach out of the question. You're giving people the tools they need in order to get the job done, or in order to access the space just as anybody else. So you see an example of equity on the right side of this image. The person in the red shirt didn't need anything at all in order to enjoy the game. The person in pink seems a lot more comfortable having two boxes to stand on to see the game, whereas the person in the blue shirt is able to enjoy the game after having a ramp installed. Now, we could take this image one step further by replacing that plank fence with a chain link, reducing the need for anybody to have boxes or ramps. Something I noticed in my stepdaughter's elementary school during her violin concert this spring was to get to the stage, there wasn't a set of stairs. There was just a ramp. So it didn't matter if you had a mobility aid or not. It didn't matter if you needed extra support. Everybody got onto the stage the same way. And I thought that was a really neat concept of universal design in action. So what are some examples of equity in our world? For example, there's data plan discounts for customers with disabilities. So for example, I use an AI transcription service called Otter AI in situations where I need help understanding what's going on. And so that means I use a lot more data than I would normally if I didn't need that service. So companies like Bell and Rogers actually have discounted data plans to accommodate for that. And of course, another example would be university student accessibility centers. Next, so what is diversity and inclusion? So diversity encompasses everything that makes us unique. And something I found a few years ago when I first started researching presentations like these was the concept of diversity dimensions and how it plays into intersectionality. So primary diversity dimensions are things you can't change about yourself. So these include your race, your age, sexual orientation, whereas secondary diversity dimensions are things you can change about yourself. So these things include your geographic location, your religion, or your socioeconomic status. Inclusion is all about leveraging diversity to create fair, equitable, and healthy environments. You cannot have inclusion if diversity is not at the core of what you're doing. And I really enjoy this quote from Helen Henderson, who is a writer, author, and disability advocate. Inclusion works to the advantage of everyone. We all have things to learn, and we all have things to teach, which I think also speaks to the importance of having all of these different kinds of voices at the table, especially in the kind of work we do. This next section of the presentation covers barriers to equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And these barriers, commonly classified as lots of different isms, there are not just four, but these are four big ones I'll be choosing to focus on today for our session. The first is classism. And so classism is differential treatment based on a social class or a perceived social class. And so that includes things like your economic status, your level of education, and job status. Something I found to be really shocking when researching this presentation was that a Yale study found that interviewers presume a candidate's socioeconomic status within their first 7 spoken words. Could you imagine walking into a job interview and potentially having the decision made within the first 7 words? It's incredible how much people gather and what conclusions they can already draw just from what your voice sounds like, what kind of words you use, how you look, how your hair is, what you're wearing. It's incredible. It carries so much weight on something like a job interview, which is a huge decision for yourself and potentially for your family. I do have an example on here of engineering education, as it's getting increasingly expensive, as is the cost of living. So students still have the same number of options. They can take a student loan with the government, they can take a bank loan, they could do a part-time job, you can apply to all the scholarships under the sun. And some people are lucky enough to be able to have family help. But what's interesting is I'm seeing a cycle of tuition is going up. So for example, UMB's tuition has increased 10% over the past 2 years. An increase of tuition, which makes it already more difficult for folks to afford. Wages are not going up in comparison to that. So it's more difficult to pay for school simply from a summer of hard work. And so now you have more students taking on part-time jobs, but when you're working part-time, while going to university. It's more difficult to keep your GPA up, which folks need a higher GPA in order to keep larger scholarships. And so then sometimes it can all fall apart because you're fighting to do well in school, you're fighting to work and afford to live and afford to eat healthy food. And what normally falls to the wayside are things like your mental health, your ability to have meaningful time with family and friends. And it's a really interesting cycle, and one that I think needs a lot of work. An example to apply this to a workplace could be just like fun gatherings you may have. So for example, at my work, our team often has a fun activity once every month or two. And something that's really important is to keep in mind that the more senior folks may or may not have an easier time affording more expensive outings than, say, an entry-level person who is still getting getting their feet under them, who is starting to pay off student debt, etc. And so for these work outings, whether they're official or not, I do encourage you to think about cost inclusion when you are planning these things to make sure that everybody who would be interested in attending is able to attend if they would like to. Next, I'll discuss sexism. And sexism is prejudice or discrimination based on sex, and particularly within the engineering industry, it's especially discrimination against women. And many of us know this is very prevalent in engineering. And according to the Canadian Women Foundation in 2019, full-time working Canadian women made 76.8 cents for every dollar men made for the same exact job. Now we're in 2023, so I'm hoping that figure is a bit better. That was the most recent one I could find. And I'm not sure when we will close the pay gap, but I do recognize we're making progress, and I encourage everyone to keep pushing until the wage gap is nothing, because there's no reason for women to make less than men for the same amount of work. I'm sure some of you are also aware of Engineers Canada's 30 by 30 initiative. This initiative by Engineers Canada is to have 30% of newly licensed engineers be women by the year 2030. I had looked at an infographic on their website, and they had updated the numbers at the end of 2020. And so New Brunswick, for example, was at, I believe, 16.3%. 10 years out from the goal, we're just over halfway there. So there's a lot of work to be done. For example, there's also the ongoing 30 by 30 conferences. There was a session last week hosted by Engineers Canada, and there's a session being hosted next week also by Engineers Canada. So I really encourage you to Google Engineer Canada's 30 by 30 conference. There's also an in-person event in Halifax if you're in the area. So I really do encourage you to check out those resources. The first session I went to was wonderful, and I'm really excited to join the next one next Wednesday afternoon. Also from Engineers Canada website, I found this 2011 US study called Stemming the Tide, Why Women Leave Engineering. And a few of the main points about why women are leaving were that almost half of the women surveyed left because of working conditions. So that included the amount of travel, that included the pay, that included lack of advancement opportunities, and 30% left due to organizational culture. So these women took all this time, worked so hard in engineering to get that degree. Some continued working really hard to get their professional license, and they still decided to leave the industry because they did not feel safe, because they did not feel included. And that's not okay. Next, I would like to cover ableism. So ableism is the belief that people with disabilities have less worth than people without. And ableism can be obvious or subtle. It can be legal. It can also be illegal. For example, refusing a job to someone with a disability. Very illegal, but it happens. 2 summers ago, I was applying for work and I had actually received 2 offer letters for engineering roles. And when they had issued me the offer letter, I had asked some questions about potential accommodations for my hearing loss because phone calls are difficult for me. And I had both offer letters rescinded. And the reason was, we no longer think you're a good fit for the job because we use the phone a lot for conferences. And it was really disappointing to not even have the opportunity to say, okay, why can't we switch to like Zoom? Why can't we do Teams or Google Meet? It was just a flat out no, not because of my knowledge or lack thereof, not because of anything but the fact that my ears didn't work. It's illegal, but it was really hard on my mental health. And I decided not to pursue action because I was afraid of putting in all of that effort to filing a complaint only for potentially nothing to happen with it. I didn't want to work for those companies anyway after that. So it was a tough decision, and it made it really hard for me to apply to jobs after that. I only applied to one position last year, and thankfully I got it. And that kind of culminated in the position I have this summer. But just the fear that had instilled in me of thinking that I wasn't good enough or I didn't deserve to be an engineer, not because of my skills, not because of who I am, but because of my ability to hear. Another example is parking in an accessible parking space if you don't have the accessible parking tag. And an outdated term for that is handicap parking. I think this one is pretty self-explanatory. If you don't need to use that space, there are people who need it. And it's actually punishable by really high fines. I think in Fredericton, the fine is around $220. So I can definitely appreciate if that would be higher in the more densely populated areas for folks joining us today all over Eastern Canada. And finally, ableism can be simply as refusing to believe somebody's disability disclosure because it's not visible. It's interesting to note that most disabilities are invisible or subtle compared to having a visible disability. And this is what I mean by invisible or visible disabilities. So invisible disabilities are difficult to see or determine just by looking at somebody. So a comment I often get is, wow, I would never be able to tell you had hearing loss. It's like, well, my problem is on the inside of me. And maybe that's why they call it an invisible disability. And then people kind of click and they're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Whereas visible disabilities are a bit more obvious. You know, for example, a wheelchair user is an example of someone who may have an invisible disability. And it's never okay to simply not believe somebody if they choose to share with you that they have a disability. Another personal story I have for this is I have a special accommodation for school where I give my professor a Bluetooth microphone to feed through a Zoom call to a professional stenographer. And one day we had a guest speaker come. And so I'm explaining to the guest speaker kind of just what it is and how it works. And I have a student come up behind me and say, she's lying. She can hear. I saw her talking on the phone the other day. And it was just this really embarrassing and shocking situation where the guest speaker didn't really know what to do. The instructor wasn't there. And he kind of awkwardly just clipped it on. And I just kept my head down the whole time. And I didn't say anything and I didn't engage. And it was really hard. So I just encourage you all to be mindful of that when people share sensitive things like a potential disability or chronic illness with you, because there are more of us than you think. According to Statistics Canada in 2017, 22% of Canadians, which equated to 6.2 million people at the time, had at least one disability. And I know more recent figures show that New Brunswick actually has the most, or the second most, highest population of people with disability in the province. So 26% of disabled Canadians were unable to afford assistive devices and prescription medications. So the things that enable us to work or to do our job well, we had trouble affording simply because we can't afford those extra expenses. For example, my hearing aids are $4,000 each. I'm so blessed to have had that funded through through community funding. But before I knew that funding existed, I was paying a $200 a month rental fee, working 3 part-time jobs while doing full-time school. It's an incredible cost to have to pay to be able to fully participate, or at least partially participate in the world around us, just because we're different than people who don't have a disability or a chronic illness. So this really translates to the employability of people with disabilities and chronic illnesses, because 59% of people with disability were employed compared to 80% of non-disabled people. So that's a gap of 21%. We have a workforce who wants to work. We want to participate in society, but sometimes things just look a bit different than to us, and we need things in a different way. And this really speaks to the importance of doing things like universal design when we are building and growing our world. Next, I want to discuss homophobia and transphobia. And homophobia is defined as the fear, hatred, discomfort with, or mistrust of people who are gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And that definition comes from Planned Parenthood. Transphobia is the fear, hatred, discomfort with, or mistrust of people who are transgender, genderqueer, or don't follow traditional gender norms. And it's important to note that gender and sexual diversity exist on spectrums. There's spectrums of gender identity, gender expression, sexual attraction, and romantic attraction. The infographic you see on the right is from the Canadian Centre of Gender and Sexual Diversity. And its goal is to kind of help you discern what all of these different spectrums are. So gender identity comes from our head. It's how we identify. And folks can identify as a female, woman, or girl. They can identify as male or man. And then there's other genders folks can identify with. For example, there are folks who are non-binary or non-gender conforming. The gender expression is how we present ourselves on the outside. So some days we can dress more masculine, some days folks can dress more feminine depending on how they're feeling. Or androgynous is when folks decide to dress in a way where somebody looking at them may not be able to discern that their gender or gender identity just from how they look on the outside. Sex assigned at birth is determined by which reproductive organs you're born with. So you can be born with female reproductive organs, you could be born with male reproductive organs, or if you are born with both sets of reproductive organs, you may be diagnosed as intersex as a baby. Next, we have physical and emotional attraction. And so these are kind of defined in a cute way as emotional attraction is who you would like to watch Netflix with, whereas physical attraction is who you would like to Netflix and chill with. And that was coined from the Genderqueers Canada equity, diversity, inclusion training that they put on. And if you're not aware, Genderqueers Canada is a national nonprofit organization that represents queer engineering students across the country. And I took a lot of information on this slide from that presentation. Next, I wanted to share a bit about pronouns. And pronouns are how we refer to each other in the third person. We use them every day. So the most common sets of pronouns are she, her, he, him, they, them. There are also other sets of pronouns that aren't listed here, but if you Google gender inclusive pronouns, you'll be able to find more information about those. Folks can also choose to use a combination of pronouns. So for example, someone's pronouns may be she, they, or maybe they, him. It's important to note that when folks share pronouns and they're a combination, the one they list first is normally the one that they prefer. And it's important not to use those pronouns interchangeably within the same conversation. So for example, if you have someone that uses they, she pronouns and you start talking about them using them, they, them pronouns, it wouldn't make sense to switch to she, her pronouns in the middle of that sentence. It takes a lot of practice, but that's why we're here. We're growing, and practicing is an important part of being inclusive. So when we respect pronouns, it's great to ask what they are if they're not already given. Some folks always introduce themselves, say like, hi, my name is Cassie, I use she, her pronouns. What's your name and pronouns? Folks can also include pronouns in their email signature. I have mine after my name in French and English. And it's important to know that when someone shares their pronouns with you, to respect them. You may not always get it right, but it's really important to practice. So if you make a mistake, just quickly correct yourself and move on. But maybe take the time on your own afterwards to practice some sentences talking about that person using their correct pronouns. So my friend Mary is so great. I'm so glad I got to see them today. I really like their hair and how colorful it is because they just got it done at the salon. And it's also important to note that people's pronouns, identities, and preferences can and will change over time. We're fluid people and we're always evolving as individuals. So it's important to check in with the people you love and make sure we're respecting everybody as best we can. Next, I just wanted to list some tips on fostering an inclusive environment. These are just very general tips. So I've touched on intent versus impact a little bit. And as humans, we all have the best intentions, you know, we don't want people to be hurt by our words. We want people to feel included and like they can talk to us. But sometimes it doesn't always come off that way. And that's when the impact of your words or actions is different than the intent. And that will happen over time. But what's important is how you manage an unintentionally negative impact to your words or actions. I also encourage you to question your gut reactions. If in your gut you feel like something isn't right, it definitely could be because something isn't right. If you're not able to take stock of that in the moment, I encourage you to reflect back on it and think, why did you feel that way? Is there anything you could have done better next time? And of course, I encourage you to continue sharing your pronouns as long as you're comfortable. Some folks may not be comfortable sharing their pronouns, and that's okay too. Maybe one day they will. And it's all about them and their growth and respecting their boundaries as well. I encourage you to continue to network with people with different backgrounds than you. As I said earlier, diversify your social media feeds, visit different kinds of restaurants that don't have North American cuisine. I encourage you to visit different businesses that are run by cultures that are different than yours. It's so cool to have different kinds of conversations with folks that I've had just popping into their shop and just learning a little bit about their world and where they come from and how they see the world. As always, keep an open mind. We are evolving so fast as a people, and sometimes it's even hard for me to keep up, but I encourage you to keep having an open mind. And I want to leave this slide on compassion versus comprehension. Comprehension is not required in order to show compassion. As is a theme with this presentation, we're all on different steps of our learning journeys, and why we may not understand why somebody feels a certain way or why somebody experiences things a certain way doesn't mean we're unable to show them compassion, respect, and kindness. And now I have some hyperlinked EDI resources if you are curious and looking for ways to continue your own learning paths. I have a link to the National Educational Association of Disabled Students. And what's unique about this national nonprofit organization is it not only represents disabled undergraduate students, it also represents disabled graduate students, which is really important and a gap I've found through Canadian universities and funding opportunities as a whole is oftentimes grad students are left out, which has created a really big gap for disabled students to pursue postgraduate degrees or certificates. I also linked to EduCareers Canada, as I mentioned. They are a national nonprofit organization that represents queer engineering students across the country. If you're planning an inclusive event, I did include a few resources. The York University or Lassenod School of Engineering has the inclusion lens for event planning. And in the bottom left, we have a guide called So You Want to Host an Inclusive and Accessible Conference. I use that one a lot to help me plan the Canadian engineering competition back in 2021 and 2022. I've also linked in the bottom middle, Engineers Canada's Women in Engineering Committee, their original report and action plan, and they may have an update on their website as to where they're currently at with that, with those action plans. And then finally, Engineers Canada also has a really nice guide to acknowledging First Peoples and traditional land. So I do encourage you to give that a read as well. And before I open the forum to questions for everybody, I had some reflection questions I'd like to pose to you. Don't feel obligated to answer these in the chat or out loud. I encourage you to use these questions and just kind of reflect on yourself. So in what ways has this session challenged your assumptions or beliefs about diversity and inclusion? How will you work to overcome any implicit biases you may have? What are some personal experiences that have shaped your views on diversity and inclusion? And finally, how do you plan to hold yourself and others accountable for promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion? Thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you, and I would love to open the floor to questions.
Thanks so much, Cassie. If anyone has a question, we can promote you so that you can talk out loud, or as she said, feel free to message in the chat. I could listen to Cassie talk all day, so please share some questions so we can pick her brain a little bit.
I have one question actually for you, Cassie. So what are your recommendations if someone opens up to you about struggles that they're having in equity and diversity or inclusion?
That's a really good question. The first thing I always really encourage is thanking the person for trusting you with that information, because it's important to kind of keep in mind the potential buildup to that person choosing to disclose that information or those experiences to you. They could, I know for me personally, whenever I go to speak to somebody about an issue I'm having, whether or not it's a person in power who can change things, I always worry about what they'll think of me, or if I'm actually right, or if I'm just overreacting. And sometimes I try and gaslight myself out of doing it. I convince myself that no, it's not a problem. And so that's why I always really encourage people to thank you for trusting them. What kind of comes next is really dependent on what is shared and if you're in a position or have capacity to be able to help at all. So if there's any amount of things that are not safe, escalate it with that person's permission as soon as you can, because we want everybody to be safe at the end of the day. That's unacceptable if that person isn't safe. If safety is okay and it's more of a really uncomfortable situation or it's a potential culture thing, I would encourage If there's like an EDI committee or an EDI person, I really encourage connecting with them, again, with the person's permission, to kind of see what can be done. There's no one size fits all approach. It's really kind of tailored to what kind of team you're on, what the culture is like. But my main points are thank them for trusting you, ensure their safety, and if they would like to do something about it, then helping and supporting them in doing something about it. Help you be a great colleague and friend as well.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll ask another question. Always see if anyone throws some in the chat there.
Sure.
I'm curious, Cassie, in your experiences at university, at work, like what techniques or methods have you used to maybe bring up an EDI concern to like senior leadership or someone in power, and like what tends to be the approach that works for you the best, or would you recommend?
That's a really good question, because I've done things the correct way and I've also done things the incorrect way. Something that was important to me personally was first learning what my actual rights are. So in New Brunswick, that's heavily placed on what's called the New Brunswick Human Rights Act. And I know there's similar legislation in other provinces. And so when I read the act and I understood it, which took a long time, legislation language is really hard. That is really what gave me solace in when I'm not convincing myself out of a problem existing in the first place. And so when I had that to lean into and like, okay, these are my rights. I am allowed to say this. I am allowed to require this. And oh, it's required by law. That can be a blessing and a curse sometimes. Then it's a matter of, well, who do I go to? Who are they? Can I trust them? Talking to people around me, figuring out, okay, this is the person at first I should go to, and not like directly trying to like fish around for information, but just trying to figure out who they are, if they're a safe person to talk to. If they are, great. I'll ask for a meeting and explain the issue a little bit. But if maybe they're not, or you're not able to get information, you're not comfortable, then escalate it up a level. So at school, that would be starting with the chair of the department. If the chair isn't a good fit, maybe I started with just talking to profs I was able to confide in and I felt safe with, and who were supportive of me and my accommodations, and they were able to help guide me to a person who had more power than them to be able to help. So that whether that meant sometimes it was the dean, sometimes it was the vice president academic of the university. In the workplace, it's a bit different. I've been really blessed to have really supportive supervisors and managers who have made sure I have everything I need to succeed. And if you find yourself in a situation where that's not the same, it's definitely an option to kind of go up over their head to the person above them and say, you know, this isn't about this person. I'm just simply trying to get the issue resolved as best as I can. And knowing kind of what outcome you're looking for, I need these accommodations in place. I need this software in order to do my job. I need adjusted working hours because what's happening right now just isn't working for me. Is really good. And starting the conversation off polite but firm, you know, don't get talked out of saying like, oh, but you're technically doing your job right now. And I'm like, sure, I am, but can you imagine how much better of a job I could do if I had everything I needed to succeed, you know? And use the legality card very, very carefully. because sometimes it's true, it is your rights. They can't be taken away from you, but sometimes that can put up a wall in some people when you don't necessarily want it to. Sometimes they feel like, okay, now I'm in a corner. Whereas in other cases, it can just be used as an education tool and and I've been I've been the first for a lot of situations. And so there's been a level of teaching to it. So kind of once I get what I need, I kind of explain, okay, this is this piece of legislation. This is what it means. It's not meant to put you into a corner. It's meant to empower the people it's meant for, to help them get the tools and what they need to succeed.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. And I think just the minutes that it took you to go through that really emphasizes to me how important it is that the people who are in those higher positions and levels of power also take these kinds of trainings and know how to empower the people that are under them, so that it's not always 100% on the person who's, trying to get their rights met, for sure. It sounds like you've been
Exactly.
through lots of processes.
It's a really, really heavy journey. Exactly. And something I've been just such a huge proponent of is we cannot expect people to create accessible and inclusive spaces if we don't give them the tools to do so. That really just doesn't make sense. You would not walk into a biology class and expect somebody knowing how to dissect a worm if they were given no instruction on it. And the same is true for accessibility and inclusion as well, right? And I appreciate what you said about how much weight it is to actually get to that point, to reaching out. I've had a lot of issues with academic accommodations over the years for a variety of reasons. A lot of it centered in professor ignorance. They just didn't understand what was happening. But for me, when I would experience issues, I would obsess over it, thinking like, okay, what are all the itty bitty details? Did I say something mean? Did I leave something out? Ask 5 friends, can you please read this email for me before I send it?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of weight that goes into fighting for yourself and advocating for yourself. And so you're right. It's really important that people at all levels of an organization receive this kind of training, because it's easier to take in feedback. It's easier to help accommodating people if you've started on this own learning journey yourself.
Absolutely. And it's definitely a journey. I know throughout university, I've seen you speak a few times and have been to other EDI trainings, and I literally learned something new, or more than one thing, every single time. Like, going to one of these is not the be all end all. And you've got to keep that open mind that you said at the end of your presentation, and keep journeying through it.
Exactly.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions in the chat here. Thanks everyone for attending, and thank you to Cassie for presenting today. I guess that wraps up the webinar, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their Tuesday.
Thanks. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.